I would like to ask those present to take their seats. There are many of us, and this is why organization may be complex. I'd like to congratulate our president of the Socialists and Democrats, Asha Perez, and say welcome to all speakers, in particular those up at the table, Da Silva, Zapatero, and say that for the Socialists and Democrats, holding this event is of a major political importance, showing our involvement in creating the best policy in Europe and Latin America, making this further step with a view to improving those of 1,000 million people in these territories, which is the reason for this meeting. And this is why we're here today. And so without any further ado, what I'm here to do is just to give the starting shot after handing the floor to Irache, our president. You have the floor, Irache.
Queridos presidentes,
Dear Presidents, President Lula, Zapatero, Claudia Sheinbaum, head of government of the city of Mexico, or Mexico City rather, just on behalf of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats, and on my own behalf, I just want to thank you all for this your participation in this first meeting of our political family. It's been our honor to organize featuring Latin America today. So deputies, civil society, press, and diplomatic corps, we welcome you all. You're here today in the hemicycle of the Parliament. It's our honor to be here today. And it's an honor for me to say a few things about the Caribbean and Latin American regions, really coming from the heart of European democracy. Now, I get the same feeling that I get back when I first was in Mexico and Cuba in my first visit in Latin America as head of the socialist group, this before COVID struck. I think that the feeling was mutual between Latin Americans and Europeans. This is the fruit born of a long shared history and our cultural fusion and our friendship between the peoples of Latin America and of Europe. I think about what Garcia Lorca said, that a Spaniard who's not been in Latin America doesn't really know what Spain is. The links between Latin America and Europe have very deep roots. We should not forget that our history is a shared history, and it is at the very part of the human rights and universal human rights. Through time, we've seen that our shared history also is giving us a brotherhood which continues there and here between so many families. These family links would not have been possible if Latin America had not been a country which welcomed for the most darkest moments of the history of Europe in the 20th century and parts of the last century. Many left and went to your lands looking for a brighter future. So political reasons, or perhaps due to a lack of possibilities, Europeans and Latin Americans have migrated. They saw this migration as an opportunity. In these times of difficulty, the countries of Latin America opened their doors so that we could find in your countries a life of dignity which Europe was not offering at that time. Through these times of crisis, we saw that we needed to change, and that's where the European project was born. This partnership between Europe and Latin America now enters a new phase of cooperation. Our common roots, our shared past, our shared institutions, our countries meeting with the unions bringing together Latin American countries. That means that the links between our countries are very, very strong. They're among the most binding links in history. And we've only been able to do this thanks to the principles upon which our agreements are built. That, first of all, there's mutual respect. There's respect for reciprocity and equality. This has allowed us to find common solutions to overarching challenges like global warming, unilateralism, gender equality, regulated world trade, and the 2030 agenda and the fight against tax havens. Our agreements also makes it possible to foster human rights, and that respect enables us to have frank discussions. We see that now Latin America is going through a time of change, and if something has taught us, history has taught us, is the fact that being adaptive and open to change is something that cannot be avoided. It also brings along with it opportunities. The new times and the future of Latin America will have to be decided by the people of Latin America themselves. In the social democratic family, we have always defended that only change which comes out of the social and political motors of a country inside that country will be successful in improving matters. It's important that citizens have a voice. They need to be able to express their preferences. Their rights have to be respected, including their right to freely express their ideas, they freely meet and to associate with others. From Nicaragua to Brazil, going through Colombia, Cuba, Chile, and Bolivia, we have always raised our voices when we saw that rights were under threat. And in much the same way, this House is a voice when the rule of law is under threat on our own continent. We see it happening in Hungary and in Poland today. So in this process of change in Latin America, we wanted to assist. We want to help. We want to do that on the basis of mutual respect and on the basis of our personal experience. We have a constitutional framework, rule of law in Europe, and Europeans have, in this context, gone through the best period of our existence as democratic states. We have learned that it is via democracy that you have the best defense of human rights possible, for freedom, for human democracy, and or rather for human dignities. Democracy is the best form of government. It contributes the most to the well-being of individuals and states, and it is the rule of law. And here, the socialist movement has been in the vanguard since World War II of improving the lives of everyone. Now, President Lula, it is now time to call to an end this nightmare of a right-wing populist in the presidency. You can count on our support, the progressive socialist and democratic family, to have your back on this effort.
Vivimos en un mundo en...
Well, this is a world where no country can live in isolation. That's why we want to continue to work with you together for a better future. History has taught us that when the European Union and Latin America work together, arm in arm, our influence is decisive in the world. Together, we have worked on behalf of peace in Colombia, supporting the Colombian people and President Santos with their efforts to put to an end one of the longest and bloodiest of conflicts in the world. Together, we have worked to combat Ebola in Africa, and together we are fighting the pandemic. And we have so far supplied 40 million doses of vaccine to the region via COVAX. Also, we're working together on the Paris Accord. We're also working together to meet the objectives of sustainable development of the United Nations. Just a few days ago, we again saw our strength to negotiate with the 15% now as a tax, which was approved by the G20 in Rome, and also to reduce methane gas in the COP26 in Glasgow. We've seen on both sides of the Atlantic what cooperation can do if we work together. Our cooperation improves the lives of our people. Europe is the largest investor in Latin America and the Caribbean, and also your biggest partner in terms of development and the largest supplier of humanitarian aid. We believe in negotiation and dialogue to solve any and all types of conflict. President Zapatero, your commitment to dialogue, to negotiation, and an effort to try and find consensus in extremely, extremely difficult situations is something which we must indeed should recognize as progressive forces. We think that the only alternative to the current situation is a world which is more characterized by justice and cooperation, more solidarity, more multilateralism, based on the UN system. And we think that sustainable development, if it's going to be inclusive, that indeed is the challenge before us here in the 21st century. And the fight against inequality in the world is something that will have a direct impact on our own security. President Lula, 18 years ago, your program Bolsa Familia saw the light of day, and it radically changed the lives of millions in your country by providing them with the basics of a decent life. It raised 30 million Brazilians out of extreme poverty, and it brought food security and more equality, more in school, fewer dying in childbirth, better jobs. This is simply an excellent example of good investment in one's people. As social democrats, we want to change people's lives, and we have done this. We want to make history by doing this, and we know very soon you will be making history again. Now, the response to the inequalities of globalization is not to lock yourself in isolation. No, we've got to see that the only reply which is credible is to improve the rules in the world, rules which protect people faced with injustices, that increase their rights, that defend women in Europe and in Latin America. We need to be able to raise our voices in the streets and be heard by institutions so that gender equality is made a reality, that the violence of the machismo comes to an end, and we have our role in the productive economy. These rights need to be made a reality. Mr. President. President Zapatero, you began this path, and your example in terms of defending rights was something we will always respect and recognize. We need to have economic relations based on ethics and rules. We want to have world trade which is fair, with more rights for our workers, with more protection for the environment. And we need to go beyond words. We need action. We need to have new agreements, a new generation of agreements, such as we've signed with Mexico and Chile, with Mercosur. If you have a gap, it will be filled. We've got to be a world player. We've got to have a solid player along with us in Latin America and the Caribbean. As we move past this COVID, we'll be moving into a new cycle to re-strengthen our relations. It's been too long. Since 2015, the last time we had a CELAC summit. And we want to be able to have an impact on the new balance of powers between the major world players. This is the time to do just that. We need to meet more often. We need to have more institutional and less formal meetings increased. When it comes to regional cooperation, well, we are the region which had the worst wars in the history of mankind. 70 years ago, we took the decision to put an end to such wars and to dedicate ourselves to building a united Europe. And for that, it's only normal that we also want to cooperate with other regions. Let's start with Latin America. It's only normal that we want to go down your popular path of regional unification. Integration is, of course, going to take its own form in different continents. Each country and each region should find its own path towards peace, towards growth, and towards integration. And on this path, we should not forget the fact that there are local players as well, too, because our cities, our regions, our people are crucial to also make sure that we strengthen the links between our regions and between our people. That's why today we are very, very proud of the fact that we do have a very important representative, the mayor of this Mexico City, Claudio. And we should also mention that the progressive leaders on both sides of the Atlantic have increasingly feminine side, and they are women. And we want half. We want half of the power today. There's no socialism without feminism. And we also need to keep in mind We also need to remember that the link between Latin America and the European Union is a very deep one. It's not superficial. It's something that is beyond time. It doesn't depend on the current situation. It's based upon people and societies and cultures. The millions of people on both sides of the Atlantic are the living expression of what joins our regions. Nothing that happens in Latin America is something which doesn't affect the European Union. Nothing that happens to the European Union is irrelevant to people who live in Latin America. What links us, what joins us, overcomes time and overcomes distance. Gabriel Garcia Marquez said that it's not true that people will stop following their dreams because they get old. Rather, they get old because they quit following their dreams. Those words, I think, will shine light on why social democracy is still so important and why we need to continue to work together to try and convert our dreams into an ever more just society. Thank you. And now I have the very great honor and pleasure to give the floor to President Ignacio Lula da Silva.
Eu vou começar.
Let's start. I'd like to mention a friend who gives me great pleasure to see here, Rafael Correa, as President of Ecuador. Hello, Rafael. I'd like to congratulate Irache Garcia, President of the Socialists and Democrats in the European Parliament. Salute José Luis Zapatero, former Prime Minister of Spain. Say hello to Claudio Pardo, Mayor of the City of Mexico, Mexico City, who will be delivering a speech here. Marco Perez, Vice President of the S&P, Coordinator of Eurolat, Javi Lopez, Co-President of Eurolat, Pedro Silva Pereira, Vice President of the European Parliament, and Diana Sheinbaum. I'd like to greet some of the Brazilian companions who came with me. Luiz Mercadante is Senator, is Minister of Science and Technology, Education, etc., former federal deputy, and dedicated companion and president of Peugeot Abramo. Celso Mamuri, ambassador, who was minister at the time Itamar Franca was president of the Republic. He was also defense minister. Senator Humberto Costa, member of my party, Senator of the Republic. Arlindo Chinagia, federal deputy of the Labour Party, Trabalhadores. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, My first words are words of thanks. Thanks and awareness of the extraordinary solidarity towards a progressive group, bearing in mind the coup against Dilma Rousseff without any motivation, and then putting me into prison and court cases against myself and other friends, and at the end, the preventing me from candidating to the presidency of Brazil, which of course, unfortunately, we wanted to come back to govern Brazil. This stopped us from doing it. There is a reason why some of the elite in Brazil, especially the political and economic elite, are in a difficult relations with the PT party, because after 9 years of existence, in its first bid for the presidency, the PT came second in 89. In 84, it again came second. In 98, it was again the second runner. And then it was number one. And in 2006, it won. In 2010, PT again won the elections. In 14, it was the first again. And in 2018, it would have been the first again. Unfortunately, I was prevented from running, so we were again second, and we are working hard, Rafael, so that in 2022 we shall again be the winners. My thanks are difficult to express. I can hardly thank you enough for what you have done to help the PT and the progressives in Brazil. Thank you and congratulations. I hope that it'll never be necessary to retribute your solidarity, because I really hope that you will not be victims of the atrocities that I had to suffer. Evo in Bolivia, who in Paraguay, and other companions on our continent had to endure. I'd like to say to you that it's an honor for me to have done politics in my country at the most important time of the left and progressive forces throughout Latin America. Our term in office gave me the privilege to be the president of Brazil, where Kirchner was in Argentina, Bachelet in Chile, and Bachelet in Paraguay, Rafael in Ecuador, even the companions in the right, such as Colombia, who participated in the policies we pursued. Companions who created UNASUR, wanted to strengthen Mercosur, and I lived through the most important moment of the ascension of the poor in South America and Latin America. This is a conquest which we need to thank all the presidents who presided together with us. Rafael knows why he was pushed out in Ecuador. He knows why he was persecuted. Because in the Latin American world, throughout the history of Latin America, all presidents or governors who wanted to give to the poor the right to work, the right to eat, the right to study, the right to be respected, were either persecuted or assassinated. So what's the reason for persecution persecuting Evo Morales? Couldn't he have had a fourth mandate? In fact, only Huber went for 4 mandates, but throughout the rest of the world, anyone thinking of a third mandate is already considered to be a dictator. We've seen 16 years where certain leaders kept in office. Margaret Thatcher. And that's not a dictatorship, it's not authoritarianism. But any one of us wants to have a third mandate. Well, I like talking about that because at the time I had 87% of the votes. And it seemed obvious for me to go for the third time. I didn't accept. I thought there must be alternating powers in Brazil. I, of course, never thought that we would end up with somebody like Bolsonaro who governed Brazil. Never thought about that. And in any rate, if we are at all responsible as the left, as the progressives, we need to undertake to give back democracy to the people as well as a social state. My thanks to the European Parliament for the invitation to me. It's a long time since I have had an opportunity to join at such an important event. This is a learning curve because after long years of prison, I couldn't give any interviews, and after I came out of prison, I visited the Pope. I went to Berlin, to France, and then I ended up in the lockdown, and I was at home for nearly 2 years because of the pandemic, and now I'm able to make my first speech without wearing a mask. I'm very keen, Rafael, to travel around Brazil, talking to the Brazilian people again about the importance of Brazil for the world and for democracy. Dear comrades, I have a speech written down, and I hope that I will read slowly so that the interpreters will be able to accompany the rhythm and understand what I'm saying. I have seen many speakers fighting with the interpreters, and I really don't want to create any trouble here. Dear friends, companions, members of the European Parliament, I'd like to start speaking not about Latin America, nor European Union, nor any country, continent, or economic bloc in particular. But what I do want to speak about is the huge world in which we live, all of us, Latin Americans, Europeans, Africans, Asiats, human beings of different origins. We are on a planet which is at all times trying to warn us that we need new attitudes to survive. Alone, we are vulnerable to environmental, health, and economic tragedies, but together we are able to build a better world for all of us. And yet, we discard these warnings. We insist in not wanting to learn with the mistakes of the past. The result of our lack of understanding is clear to see. Pandemics, inequality, hunger, climate emergencies, which in the near future will affect the survival of the human race on Earth. And yet, I want to state my unshakable belief in humanity. I wasn't born an optimist. I learned to be one because in many occasions in my life, I saw how much a human being can achieve and how much a people can build when there is the will and opportunities. Anyone who lives in Brazil or reads the press has every reason to be a pessimist. But wherever I go, I make sure to say Brazil can, despite the project of destruction of a band of right-wing extremists who don't know what it is to look after a country and its people. Brazil can do, despite 19 million Brazilians being hungry, despite 19 million of unemployed and dispirited who've given up to look for a new job, despite the attacks against the blacks and indigenous populations, despite the destruction of the environment in the Amazon region, despite especially of the deaths of 610,000 Brazilians, many avoidable if the present government had been willing to combat seriously the coronavirus. Despite this, I say with conviction that Brazil can do. I know this because in a recent past we were able to rebuild and change the country, and we are able to rebuild it again. Equally, I believe that Brazil can do. I think the world can, despite the 750 million people who are hungry, despite the 5 million of dead under COVID-19, despite the inequality that grows, despite ethnic, religious, geopolitical conflicts which feed wars. As I said in the beginning, my optimism is not an accident, but it comes from experience. I believe that mankind can manage. Because I'm here at the European Parliament today, together with representatives of countries which in the mid-20th century were ferocious enemies. 60 million people died in the Second World War. And I believe that some of your ancestors did fight each other, killed, died, and suffered the atrocities of war. You and your countries, therefore, would have reasons to hate each other. And yet, you are the players of one of the most extraordinary experiences of history, modern history, which was the building of the European Union. You are now here. You are now here in this European Parliament, in a climate of peace, looking for solutions together to build an ever better Europe. We know the huge power of destruction which a human being has in its hand, and very many times it didn't hesitate to use. But we must never forget that humanity has an extraordinary ability to build and to rebuild. The European Union, the European Parliament, and you, ladies and gentlemen, European Parliament members, who are an example of this human virtue. The European Union is not perfect, nothing is, but it's an asset of mankind as an example of cooperation and building peace and people. Ladies and gentlemen, honorable members, there are 7,600,000,000 human beings living on this planet, men, women, children and old people, rich and poor, black and white, and people of all colors. Each and every one of us has in himself his private universe. We are different from each other, each one with individual features, but all united amongst one certainty. The human being is not born to live alone, which reminds me of a line in one of the major bossa nova hits, the Brazilian rhythm, which conquered many of you. The line said, "It is impossible to be happy alone." That was Antonio Carlos Jobim, one of the great musicians on our continent. The truth is that we cannot be free when millions of children around the world are going to go to bed tonight hungry and will wake up tomorrow without knowing whether there'll be something to eat. We cannot have such inequality, which showed that the rich during the pandemic became richer and the poor are even poorer. This is manifested even in the efforts of rebuilding or changing climate change. The richest in the planet will emit 30 times more gases, and this is by 2030. The 1% of the richest, which corresponds to fewer than the population of Germany, are about to put out 70 tons per capita of gas dioxide. Meanwhile, 50% of the poor will only be emitting half that. And this was put forward by COP26 last week. The fight for preserving the environment, for me, is indissoluble in the fight against poverty and for a less unequal and fairer world. Members of the European Parliament, we need to make it clear that optimism, hope, and faith mustn't be a synonym of resignation. This is why I consider myself an indignant optimist. In 2009, the rich countries undertook to pay $100 billion per annum, starting in 2020, for countries in development to preserve nature and face up to climate change. That promise was not fulfilled, and now it's been postponed another 2 years. That is, as of 2023, there will be a transfer of $100 billion per annum to fight climate emergency. This is laudable and should be applauded, but let's forget that in the 2008 crisis, only the United States paid $700 billion to save from break up the banks which irresponsibly invested in junk bonds. At the same time, G20 earmarked $1.1 trillion to the emerging countries and world trade to combat the crisis effects. You must remember that the United States spent $8 trillion in the post-11/11 wars. This was sufficient to stop hunger throughout the world and prepare the planet to deal with the climatic change. And meanwhile, it was caused the direct death of more than 900,000 people in countries such as Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, Pakistan, not mentioning those dying of lack of water. In other words, there are resources to save banks and to cause a death, but when it comes to saving human lives and the planet, that's when solidarity of the rich countries is many tens of times less. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the greatest joys I had as president of Brazil, and even after leaving the presidency, it was going around the world, invited by different countries to talk about our extraordinary economic and social advances. I was honored to be a leader in Brazil when Brazil was the 6th place in the world economy, and to show the Brazilian example how to overcome poverty and hunger in a short period of time. You can imagine how painful it is to be at an event, international event such as this, and to state and agree how Brazil went backwards since the coup in 2016 against Dilma Rousseff. Brazil is now going through social, economic, environmental, and health tragedy. We have 2.7 of the world population, and yet we have had 12% of the COVID deaths worldwide. We had over 610,000 Brazilians dying. This is not fate, but it's the attitude, criminal attitude of the present government. The present president was ironic about the seriousness of the disease. He ridiculed the death. He delayed buying vaccines. He distributed ineffective medicines. He allowed shortages of oxygen. He promoted meetings. He induced the people to distrust the efficiency of masks. He even spread fake news and even said it could lead people with HIV to develop AIDS. Ineffective experiments using human guinea pigs were carried out in Brazil, reminding us of the horrors of Nazi times. And yet 116 million Brazilians, half of our population, today is in a situation of food insecurity, moderate to serious. Of these 19 millions, nearly twice the Belgian population spend the whole day without having anything to eat. Bearing in mind Brazil is the 3rd greatest producer of food. And what's happening, because Brazil in 2014 exited the hunger map of United Nations for first time. Now the great concentration of revenue, reduction of social policies, lack of state leadership is allowing the poor to carry on without any help. The result of that equation couldn't be different. Destitution, hunger, and despair. But I'm here to show and say again to you and the world, Brazil can do it because it is better and bigger than anyone who wants to destroy it. Brazil is a country which in the past, very recently, enchanted the world with its innovative policies, taking out of extreme poverty 36 million people, equivalent of the populations of Portugal, Sweden, Denmark, and Ireland. Brazil is a country who assumed voluntarily, undertook to reduce 75% of deforestation in the Amazon as a mission to stop polluting gases. And we managed that early. We reduced by 80% the deforestation in the Amazon and minimized the march ahead of climate change. Unfortunately, the countries most responsible for the production of emissions, greenhouse emissions, they still think that they need to protect themselves, bearing in mind that climate change is going to affect only the poorest. That's a sad reality, but what they've forgotten is that all of us, rich and poor, need the same oxygen to breathe. We need clean water to survive. We need a healthy planet where our children can live healthy and in peace. Dear companions and comrades, happily, this dark age which came down on the planet because of the ascent of extreme right governments throughout the world is showing signs that it's coming to an end. Progressive candidates have been scoring major victories, this in several countries, and I'm sure it will happen in Brazil too, as of the presidential elections next year. Brazil will come back to be a positive force in the world. We will again create public policies able to change the planet for a better. We believe in a multipolar world. We will have an active foreign policy. We will strengthen Mercosur. We will rebuild the UNASUR and increase our partnerships with the European Union. We will improve the terms of the Mercosur EU agreement. We don't want Latin America turned towards farming and mining. We are able to be industrialized, technologically advanced countries. The present agreement is paralyzed because of the mistrust in European countries as to the fulfillment of promises assumed by the Brazilian government. We have vast farmlands. We have technologies. We've got farming, advanced research. Our food production doesn't have to deforest the natural forests in Amazon to grow cattle. The criminal activities should not jeopardize Brazilian economy. We have an extraordinary biodiversity, and our biomass will have to regenerate after the extinction of the present government. No more forest fires, no more deforestation or attacks to the indigenous peoples. Brazilian people don't want that destruction to continue. Brazilians want a live and standing Amazon forest, and we need to construct social alternatives, development, science, technology, and respect of the people who live in the forest and their knowledge and their culture. Friends, we believe in an ever more plural world, united amongst solidarity, cooperation, and values such as humanism and social justice. We believe in world governance, starting with a bigger council at the United Nations. We believe in a fair economy without the destruction of our environment and free from exploiting the workforce. And we believe that a different Brazil is possible, a different Europe is possible, and another world is possible, because in a very recent past we were able to build it. We can be happy together, and I'm sure that we will. The left and socialists of the whole world need to unite. So though we may make mistakes, it's because of that the extreme right has strengthened throughout the countries, because the world doesn't want any more Nazism or fascism. The world needs democracy. The world needs peace, not war. We need books, not weapons. We need love, not hate. And we will be able to achieve that. A great hug to all of you.
Muito obrigado à nossa Presidente do Grupo, Iratxe Garcia Pérez, ao Presidente.
Yes, thank you very much to our head president of the group, Iratxe Garcia Pérez, and also to Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva. Really a very strong message there. Much brings Europe together with Latin America. Much brings our progressive families together in Latin America and Europe. And indeed, together we can build a better future for our people. Aware of the major challenges, nonetheless, that we face here in Europe, too, not just in Latin America, and not just in Brazil, President Lula, indeed. But we do understand that we can face these challenges, these difficulties in our political families, and we can do that together. Now, in this phase, it is my great pleasure to present Claudio Chobumpardo, the first woman elected as mayor of the city of Mexico City, a city with 20 million inhabitants. We shouldn't forget that. Also a fervent environmentalist involved in UN efforts, and was also involved in efforts to fight some of the worst things and challenge democracy in, we mentioned here today, populism. So I would invite you to listen with great care to the recorded message which Mrs. Pardo has sent our way. Thank you.
México está viviendo tiempos extraordinarios.
Mexico is going through exceptional times, and from my point of view, this is an example for many other countries as well. This is a break with the neoliberal model. This despite the COVID-19 pandemic with so much suffering that we've had in our country and in the world indeed. Besides this, Mexico has shown that it is going to move beyond this crisis in a very quick way. We have indeed chosen, not just at the presidential level, but also the people of Mexico have decided to follow a different model. Neoliberalism in the world has shown that what it builds is inequality and millions of poor. Today we're showing that we have a different model, an economic model based on morals and ethics. It's based on the welfare state, on trying to recover the rights of the welfare state with respect for rights, and seeing that health is a right and food is a right, and helping those that have had the least opportunities to have a decent life. Working for all, starting with the poor. Looking at programs which really foster development, that really provide direct support to improve living conditions, respecting rights, for example, the universal pension for the retired, funds for young people with incapacities or disadvantages, and trying to show there are different ways that you can develop, and showing that we can build a better Mexico and a better world. So where do these resources come from to try and provide the people of Mexico with a decent life, particularly those that have so little, out of an economic model that really, at the end of the day, you start by trying to do away with corruption, with doing away with the benefits for the few, putting to good use the resources for the good of the many. That's the lesson we have learned in our past, the Juarista model. That a government, you can't have a poor people and a rich government. The resources are the people's resources. They have to be returned to the people and invested in the people. That's the best way to distribute wealth. And we have possibilities for private investment. We nonetheless do need to make sure that we aim all of this for restoring up the welfare state and respecting rights, and that we have to aim for a just society. So we're looking at democracy. For so long in our country, during the neoliberal years in particular, democracy was not respected. The rights of the people were trampled upon, and we saw massive electoral fraud, which meant that the people of Mexico had the government which they had without voting for them. But for the first time, we've got a truly, properly elected government, and that government is promoting democracy, not just at the ballot box, but also by participation. And we have a president of our country now who really does represent the people. And now the president has been president now for 3 years. He's halfway through his mandate. And we can see now that now there'll be a decision whether or not the people want to continue with this model of participatory democracy with social equity, helping those that have the least, or rather, they would like to go back to the previous model of governing. And either the majority of people in Mexico want this new model and will vote for that, and to see this coming through and bringing us through the end of the COVID crisis. We certainly in Mexico, in the city of Mexico, are on one side here, on the fourth transition of Mexico, as we rebuild our city. We're reopening possibilities of access and the enjoyment of rights to our citizens. In this period of 3 years, where we have been calling the shots in our city, we have had our project at the heart of our efforts. All the children who go to public schools are getting a subsidy, which makes it possible for them to indeed actually benefit from an education. A monthly payment, money for school uniforms. All the public schools are involved, and money is being invested in infrastructure. And the mothers and fathers are involved. The teachers are involved. Resources are being made available for the best for our schools. We have new curricula for our students, and we've seen 5 new elementary schools and 2 new universities, one for health studies. And all of this has made it possible for young people in our city to have access to university educations. That wasn't the case before. We're talking about thousands and thousands of young people. So we've converted health into a recognized right, not just during this period of COVID, not just in terms of preventing infections, but no, we're setting up a project which we call Health for Well-Being. Now, this Health for Well-Being program aims to cover everything from prevention to treatment, and it should be free. There should be free access to health care. That wasn't the case before. Everything was being privatized for so many years in our country. Access to housing, too, but also access to sports, to culture, to sustainable lives, and to mobility. We have set up the largest network of buses in the world in our city, so that the poor people on the outskirts can come into the center of the city, from the outside into the inside, recognizing so many rights. This is a project of social justice. And when it comes to the environment, that's a very large part of our 4th transformation program. Here we are trying to transform public life in our country. We saw the first transformation as being independence, the second, the reform led by Benito Juarez and the liberals of Mexico, and the third revolution in Mexico, or transformation, was Cerro Cárdenas, which led to the distribution of land and recognition of land rights and having access to natural resources to the people. And now this is the fourth transformation, which is being led by López Obrador, our president. This transformation is to become an innovative society, one based on the rule of law and rights. And we want to use the tools of the Republic to aim to eradicate corruption, to do away with the privileges of the politicians. We want to make sure that they're paid a fair wage, but not more. We want to make sure they behave like proper citizens. We should be citizens governing citizens. There shouldn't be a political class and then the people. We are a people close to the people, close to our citizens. And in this method of governing, we have saved resources, and that's also been the case during the COVID pandemic. It has allowed us to make a better use of our resources and get them to the people. This is what we call our moral economy, our ethical economy, one based on solidarity. It's not just about money, it's about social development, but really it also goes beyond that. It's a new model for development where we think about the economics, we think about the social side of things, we think about the environment, and we try to find a way that we reduce the tremendous inequalities which have characterized Latin America for so long, and Mexico's no exception there. Fighting corruption, but at the same time trying to find a new school of thought. Every day we think about changing our mindset, changing our attitudes in the light of this project. It's based on brotherhood. It's based on equality. It's based upon being happy doesn't mean just grabbing as much as you can. No, it's trying to help everyone as much as you can. And that's what our president, Manuel López Obrador, has recently aimed to do in the UN Security Council. And what he showed was that indeed, and stated that you cannot have peace between nations if you don't end with the tremendous inequality and poverty in the world. The way we do that is by redistribution of wealth. And here, the United Nations really needs to be in the vanguard here. It shouldn't be as in the past, as letting the richest countries have, for example, in vaccines, have all the vaccines, and then the poor countries, as is always the case, where they are the ones that get the wonderful honor of being last in line. No, they shouldn't be the last to get rights and privileges. What was proposed by our president was fraternity, to do away with the 1.2 billion poor people in the country, or in the world rather. That we've got to make sure that the rich of this world and the 20 richest countries of the world should create a fund, and that fund's resources then should be used to promote equality, fraternity, and to combat poverty in our world. Now, when the COP26 was winding up, and indeed the commitments made by countries were largely lacking in terms of cutting back on CO2 and other global warming gases. Well, the question of adaptation of the poorest countries in particular, well, I mean, obviously combating climate change requires resources, but we can't see the problems of climate change in isolation. I mean, you've got to see that this is something which really goes back to the larger need for sustainable development. We can't just look at the environmental side, in other words. We can't just look at the mere mitigation and limitation of gases. We've actually got to see that this is something that requires a new model for development, where the environment is part of that equation, but so is the social facet, the reduction of inequality, reduction of poverty, a new model of development, a new way of thinking, where the other is part of our calculations. And it's not just based on accumulation of wealth and of money. Otherwise, if we don't change our mindsets, we won't successfully tackle climate warming. We need to have fairness, equity, one where we don't just mention the rich and the poor. Now, we've got to make sure that there's equality on each level. This, of course, also means equality between men and women, between different sexual persuasions and gender choices. We need to see each and every other as someone like ourselves. That's the new way we need to think. This is what we mean by a new ethical approach, and our planet needs this change.
Agradecemos a Cláudia Pardo esta alocução inspiradora.
Thank you very much. Congratulations on this great project. We heard how this progressive movement has been winning its battles, and we've seen that this was experienced in 2004, when in Spain we had the law on gender equality spearheading something which we now almost take for granted. Luis Rodriguez Zapatero, elected Secretary General of the Spanish Party, from 2004 to 2011 was Prime Minister of Spain. And he promoted initiatives in the relations between Latin America and the European Union. I have the honor of giving the floor to Mr. Zapatero.
Muchísimas gracias, Pedro.
Well, thank you very much, Pedro, for those very kind words. Well, first of all, I'd like to just give my thanks and congratulations to Arachi. Well, my thanks really from the depths of my heart for having invited me to this very, very important meeting today. And my congratulations, first of all, for having been re-elected. Congratulations there. Well, socialists and progressives here in Europe should be proud of that. We should have hope and be reassured with you as our leader. Again, let's have a round of applause. Congratulations, Arache. Now, the second congratulations are for what you said in your opening remarks. I think you really hit the nail on the head. You had the right tone. You really set the priorities, and you had a very, very clear view of what is the situation here and in Latin America. Now, the third congratulations, because you have done so much to promote, you and Javi Lopez, and have organized these days. I've always had a great deal of respect for this institution, the European Parliament. This is not the first time that I've spoken to friends here in the Parliament. This is not the first time I've spoken here at this podium. I've always considered the European Parliament to be the largest accomplishment of the European project. It really does represent the highest level of civilization for a political entity. Bringing together 27 countries, speaking in, well, so many languages, with a history of war and conflict. Pretty much it was never-ending war. A war since Roman times never was marked by such a long period of peace as such as that since the setting up of the European community. That is Europe. I respect this institution. I have trust in this institution. I have trust in the European Union. I have faith here in the Union and in the Parliament. And so here, this congratulations, I want to voice this because the European Union will, at some point in the future, be seen as what the world was capable of. The hardest thing before the European Union is going to be making sure that we help build a worldwide family. We need to be faithful to the values which underpin our union, that are deep in our hearts. We've got to fight for peace always, always for peace.
Esta institución
This institution and the European Union were born of horror, born of heart-wrenching drama of war. 2 world wars took place. They took flame, and they took flame on our continent, Europe. I think when one thinks about that, one should be humble, and humility is what should characterize the way that one sees our project here. After these 2 world wars, which started and were fought on our continent and then extended to the whole world, well, I think that the main lesson to take home when it comes to the European Union is indeed that. Don't start giving lessons. No. We need to respect, to help, and to enthusiastically search for what this institution via peace made possible, understanding, dialogue, and peace. If the European Union gets that message across and can communicate that message to the world to contribute to the international political community, well, then we will have succeeded in our historic mission. Peace and understanding on our continent is but a start. It should go further. If the European Union looking towards the future, opts for cold wars, for walls, well, we're headed to becoming redundant and pointless. That's what the choice is before us. That's where our responsibility is to be found. Transcendence. Well, our responsibilities indeed mean that we've got to go beyond our borders, and that means dialogue with Latin America. Well, of course we have shared culture. We have links in our historical past. That's important too, but there's something which is more important yet. Latin America and the region is the region which best expresses what the situation is in the world political situation as a whole. It's really in the middle. It's really the average. It's really the every man's example. And if there's progress in Latin America, the world will progress. The demographics in the region, history, politics, and world politics, all of these different factors lead us to reflect on how important the region is and how important this open dialogue is. And that's why it's so important that the European Union and this Parliament listen. We need to listen, like we are doing today. We need to listen to the leaders and the presidents from Latin America. Listen to Lula. Listen to President Lula. I visited Lula a few days after he got out of jail. In fact, I wanted to visit him in jail, but he got out right before I got there, and then I met with him just a few days out of prison. I knew he was innocent. I always knew he was. I know the man. I was just with him a few days after he got out of prison, but he wasn't upset. He wasn't full of hate. He's a man of peace and love. I was lucky enough to spend years in government when he was in power as well. This is the man who speaks most often about the poor. I've never heard anyone speak of the poor more. And it speaks of poverty and the poor and injustice and inequality and misery and poverty. We've had a link here. We had with Chirac, we had the efforts against world poverty at the UN, which were decided. Then when we met in public, he was always the political leader, but he's also the one that did the most for the poor to actually combat poverty. That's who President Lula is. He paid that commitment to social justice very dearly. Many others in history have paid a high price too, but President Lula, history is reason to be optimistic. Well, I was born an optimist myself, but and I also became more optimistic through time, through life. And today, one of the reasons I'm hopeful, what really gives me hope and what gives the international political community hope in moving forward is to have President Lula in the position to again become president of Brazil. Well, obviously, there's reasons why. Because President Lula will open up a period of integration in Latin America, and this will be a United Nations of Latin countries. This is a generational commitment of those that have come past the challenges of dictatorships, those that have fostered education of the young of Latin America. That's the future, the education of young people. This is something that then must necessarily lead to integration of the Latin American people. That's the best way to combat poverty. And the strongest statement you can make in favor of democracy and of rights, the union of the Latin American continent, like in Europe. And this isn't a false hope. This is something that we've got to pursue and promote and support. Having Lula on as the leader of Brazil again, and then Mexico, another major power, and Mexico actively fostering Latin American integration. We've got to support the president of Mexico and his call at the United Nations to eradicate poverty. The 0.2% and tax the largest fortunes, the most important companies of the world, and 0.2% of the G20 countries. What is that? Those are peanuts compared to the change that it could make for our people, for our young people, that we don't have these 700,000 or 700 million people who today are just trying to survive, that are suffering hunger each and every day. We've got to give support to this call, which was put forward by the President of Mexico. And President Lula, you have tremendous moral authority in your continent. You need to restore dialogue and the consensus. You've got to continue to promote peaceful solutions to conflict. Dialogue is not just a means to an end. It's really worthwhile in and of itself. It is an end in its means. We've only built things that are worth building with dialogue. Look at Venezuela, our dialogue there, not to impose but to discuss, with the goal being peace. Indeed, that is our responsibility, peace in all of our countries. There have been times when the process of democratization and consolidation have been called into question. We saw that happen in Bolivia. And we think of what's been said about Bolivia, and the fact that consolidating in Bolivia was so important. It's the country that's had the most coup d'etats of any country. And what was said was that the Bolivians don't want another coup d'etat. They want a government that they want. And Javi, that is what we need to think about here. And we have a world society, but we don't have a world government. We don't have a world state. We don't have world governance. That should be where we need to go in the 21st century if we want progress. We need to build a world political entity. And when we think about the European Union and this dialogue and then the building of a union in Latin America, well, now more than ever, we see what happened at the start of we're starting here in the start of the 21st century. If all of this gets distracted and we get into populism and undermining the rule of law, well, I mean, it seems that some countries have lost their will to build a more just world society. If this loss of our bearings means that we're going to have more multilateralism, or less rather, and everyone's going to be in isolation, that's going to fight against having plans to rebuild Latin America. I think about the Nezabresa plan. I would think it would be great if the European Union could promote agreements on recovery also for Latin America. Take the monies from the IMF, from the World Bank, put them together, and the Inter-American Development Bank, other funds from the United Nations, to have a post-pandemic plan so that the region which has most suffered from the impact of COVID, Latin America, the one that's going to lose the most in terms of our criteria for measuring sustainable development, which at this very point in time, we see that there are 30 million people who have slid back into poverty. Well, we really should do this. We should be promoting a plan aimed at helping Latin America recover, that it be something that brings together all the different world and regional funding sources, including help from the European Union, and wouldn't it be great if the United States contributed too? That's the leadership we need to show at this point in time. And I am going to keep my faith in the European Union and my faith in Latin America. I've learned so much from our friends. Arachi mentioned Garcia Lorca. I always mentioned Lorca. Maria Zambrano said, Spain discovers itself in America. Well, I hope that all of our Spaniards and all Europeans indeed take this message to heart. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could rebuild the international political community based on the great values of peace and understanding and respect for cultures and for the respect for different civilizations, and say that the 21st century will not be like the 20th century. It wasn't so long ago. And when one goes back and revisits the first decades, when we had the wars of the first half of the century, we can see just how off track we were. Any weakness, any lack of sensitivity that could lead us to move towards new Cold Wars would simply be something that would not be pardonable. When the United Nations was established, when the Charter of San Francisco was approved, when we approved of the fundamental rights text, we knew that the future had to be one characterized by progress and peace. And then the goals of sustainable development were approved. But all of this will be undermined, automatically undermined, if violence, if our instinct for war, which has characterized the human past, again comes to the fore in the 21st century. These objectives of sustainable development are the major task before us, the most important in Latin America. Beyond peace are the rights of women, gender equality. It is a continent which sees way too much violence directed at one of the genders, too much gender violence. Men and women, but especially men in Latin America, and we know who we're thinking of here, we have a responsibility to condemn criminal machismo, to have respect for equality of gender, to make this really a mindset, a way of thinking, a way of approaching life. Because when women in Latin America really get to enjoy their full rights to peace, to equality, well, then we'll be much, much closer. I'll conclude. President Lula, I'm moved to see you. I saw him right after he got out of prison, but pretty much the first thing he said is, I'm in love. I was happy to hear that. I saw him happy, and we're going to see him next as president. A man who has spent his entire life fighting, a metal worker, a worker. I've learned very, very much from this man. I've learned a lot more than many people who are wearing their suits every day. Do you know what I learned? I learned that the most important thing in life is doing something for someone else. Never give up. Never surrender. And especially, you've got to be brave. If Lula hadn't been brave back when he was a metal worker, 30 million people wouldn't have come out of poverty in his country. He wouldn't have put Brazil in the leader among the leading countries as he did. There wouldn't have been hope that he brought. If Lula hadn't been brave, he wouldn't be in a position now to be president again. And that's why we have this huge historical responsibility. The challenge is that the 21st century be a century of peace and eradication of poverty with the resources that the world has. To achieve that, we've got to think the 21st century is the century of equality. We've never had a century like that in the past. We've had some progress, we've had some victories, but we are now at a point in terms of civilization wherein how can we but see that there is the wealth, unlimited wealth on the one hand and unlimited poverty on the other. How can we accept that? How can we accept people that have really wealth without limits, and then we have people that just really have poverty without limits at this point in time? How can we accept that when we look back and how can we have this? How can we live? In the past, we said, how can we have slavery? How did democracies coexist with slavery? How could that happen? And then when we abolished slavery, and then countries like the United Kingdom, well, they compensated the slave owners who had lost their slaves for the loss of property. I think of what we've been through. I'm sure that in future times, generations in the future will ask themselves, well, how could this even happen? How can we live in these societies? How can we live with so little social progress, where 1 out of every 4 women is going to be a victim of violence, when we see extreme poverty, as we see today. Today, 21 million children, because of the problems of COVID, are not going to be able to have a vaccine for the usual vaccines against polio and other childhood illnesses. This is the world in which we find ourselves. We can't rest. I can't rest at peace with this situation, not at all. And I want the 21st century to be the century of equality. How? Via peace and distribution of wealth and investment in health. I think we've got a master teacher here. Lula really is the guru of equality here. The efforts to reduce inequality. So it's men like Lula who are going to be those who are going to write the history of the 21st century, the century of equality. And I hope that it's also going to be with the signature of the European Union's involvement.
Muito obrigado, José Luís Zapatero. Palavras.
Thank you very much, Sir Zapatero. You have shared reflections about the future. I'd like to express my pleasure to call Maria Marquez and Javi Lopez, co-president of the Eurolat. Very long relations with Latin America and have worked with strengthening the relations between this parliament and the Latin American parliamentary assemblies. Maria Manuel Leto Marquez, you have the floor first. It's your turn.
Caro Presidente Lula da Silva, cara Presidente.
President Irache Garcia Perez, ministers, ambassadors from the Brazilian government, whom I've met, Mercandal, Humberto Costa, Chinaga. It was great pleasure for me. Dear colleagues, members, and in particular those who with me have been working in the Eurolat working group with much commitment and endeavor, whom I see here today in this room. Let me start by welcoming all those who are here with us at this excellent initiative from our political group, and also particularly thank those members of the Secretariat who have helped us, and David Capezuto amongst them, organizing this event, because these things don't happen by accident and only work because many have made such an effort, and also supporting President Lula and those who helped us on either side of the Atlantic. They were the ones who made this event possible. Many thanks to you for your work. And then I'd like to, my compliments to the speakers, Claudia Sheinbaum, Mayor of Mexico City. I need to say no more about her because we hope to have her one day here in person. And then José Luis Zapatero, great friend of Latin America. I've also had the opportunity of being at a meeting remotely in Bogota with him. And of course, thank you, President Lula da Silva. Thank you for coming here, and all those who came with you and are very much part of the effort made. We must be honest when it comes to the fact that Latin America has not been given the importance that it deserves from all the European institutions. For 2 consecutive years, that region was left out of the statements by the presidents of the European Union, Ursula von der Leyen, and she did not mention that region. It's 570 million inhabitants in 20 countries. That cannot be the poor cousin of the foreign policy of the European Union, especially as Antonio Costa, Prime Minister of Portugal, said here in this parliament. That's a region with whom we have the strongest historical, social, and cultural bands. Together, Europe and Latin America represent 25% of the population in the world. That's one of the reasons, not the only one, why we organize this event. We are preparing the Latin American Week, which is planned for 2022. This group, you can be assured, will always meet their most important ally in this party, in this group. We know the difficulties that Latin America has been facing, and we know how the pandemic has made some of their endeavors more difficult. One of them, maybe the main one, was the battle against inequality and poverty. 1 in every 3 Latin American persons lives in poverty. The dramatic scenario in the region, which is part and parcel also of the migration, is devastating when you think that 40% of the billionaires have grown, and there's a great gap between the rich and the poor, makes inequality the greatest menace to democracy and requires more progressive policies. We can ask people to participate in democratic life and activities. How can we say that to those who have not enough to eat, when they don't have enough water or health and healthy environment? And we've heard many times, but I repeat, that it is a family bursary, which is the first ever Brazil created, which brought out of poverty 30 million Brazilians, more than live in Portugal. And that's in a very small period of time, up to 2014. And yet, this policy helped independence of women. Since that money, they were able to access, whenever possible, structural changes in policies such as that could combat and provide new hope to citizens. And it's those policies we need to support and encourage, not only in Brazil, but in the whole of Europe and Latin America. Together, we need to be ready to develop innovative solutions. There are good solutions in the past, but we need to bring in new ones, progressive and humanist, and find solutions. We need to focus our activities. The European Union is having public funding put into combating the pandemic, bearing in mind the digital and climate transitions, the twins as we call them, both need to be fair and must not leave anyone standing without being taken in to the progress. Latin America is a natural walk. Together with the European Investment Bank, there are a number of opportunities for development and cooperation in a number of fields, both in climate matters and digital. Digital transition is indeed one of the major challenges before us, and if we're not careful and make sure that it will be inclusive, there will be even more inequality in the world at large and in each and every one of our countries and provinces. The Portuguese presidency in the European Union launched an interconnection between the city of Fortaleza and the city of Sintra in Portugal. That initiative, I dare say, you all know well. This encourages great increase of traffic of data between Latin America and Europe. Swifter and more secure, but it's not just an infrastructure for digital economy. It has to be a link for science and for development, so that the digital economy is inclusive and involves all, men and women, here and there. We need to have programs of digital education for the least favored, old people and women. It needs to be a public service, as was the electricity. We need to have specialized trading programs so that they can be prepared for new jobs and new forms of earning a living. We need to protect the forests, access to public services, and including health services. We mustn't stay behind. We need to join the future economy, prepare programs which are adapted to reality, but also regulations and laws to combat disinformation, fake news, maximizing opportunities such as artificial intelligence and 5G, which can help development. The Latin American and European progressives should be natural allies when it comes to promoting human rights, freedoms, social justice, and gender equality, which I have to mention just as my previous speakers have. In the last few decades, a number of Latin American countries progressed incentivizing this equality with women. And we saw examples of that both in Argentina and Mexico. But there have been steps back too. We've seen attacks against these new conquests, both in Europe and in Latin American countries. This is why we need to remain united in this struggle and use our foreign policy as a weapon against attacks to those rights. We mustn't allow Temer governments, for instance, to have these categories about women and ethnic groups. There are such good examples, such as Dilma Rousseff and Mrs. Bachelet. Latin America must be a place of plurality and a place for equality. President Lula, I'd like to take this occasion to give you some words of courage and incentive. There are hard battles ahead, and these opportunities should be seen and used as pivots for your programs and policies. Brazil has been under attack against its rule of law and democracy by the Bolsonaro government. Not only that, but it's been threatened in its exercising its sciences, culture over the last few years. And finally, let me strengthen our own active voice to incentivize our common aims in commercial, political, and cultural relations based on social protection and the protection of rights, which should be the basis of all progressive and democratic efforts. This should shorten the distance between Europe and Latin America. Vinicius de Moraes said, illustrating Tom Jobim's song, enough longing between nostalgia between America and the European Union. The reality is that without closer ties between the two regions, there is no peace, there is no beauty, and surely if we work together, we can look at the world with less melancholy and with less sadness and with much more confidence. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, I get to speak last, but much has been said already. I think very many relevant things have been said for the socialists, for social democrats, Europeans, and when it comes to Latin America. Well, first of all, I'd like to begin by thanking President Lula for having been here today, and for what he's done, but also for what he's going to do, the future, not just to talk about the past, but also to gather strength for what's next. And then President Zapatero, you're an example and an inspiration to us all, a president of peace, of freedom, and dialogue in Spain. And then the president of the socialist group here, Iratxe Garcia Perez. And we're very lucky here to hear Claudia Chobumpardo today too. Very important for our group, her initiatives there. It was good for her to be invited by Iratxe, a good initiative. One of the, and then today, really, we want a common agenda. We need to find one. We need to build that one. The Social Democrats need to come together. The left in Europe needs to come together and work with the left in Latin America. We need to build this conversation. This has been a good day to start. Lots of efforts have gone into this. I want to thank those that did make today possible, those that have worked in this, those that have spoken. Lots of work went behind this to make this possible. The group secretariat, lots of people involved. And I'd like to mention a few. Medite and Gerard McClone. Sorry for the names and pronunciation here, but many have worked. I want to thank what you've done that made today a reality. Why are we here today? We're speaking of Brazil, yes, but what we wanted to achieve today was to just stress the progressives in our two regions. Progressives with differences, fair enough, but we want to build the links to work together to build our relationship, which needs to be intensified based on respect, based on respecting diversity, but we need to create these links because we're going to need those links for the left in the world in the coming decade. Now, we mentioned what we have in common. We've had 4 different themes discussed today. Social justice today was first for this decade here in the 21st century. The fact that our project has always been based on social justice, but today we have inequality, which is not just an ethical requirement, but it's also an economic one, an institutional one. We've learned that not only can we try and build then to distribute, we've actually got to distribute if we want to build and to grow. That's what we've learned in the last century, that inequality is like a termite for democracy. It tends to undermine it, destruct it, and mine it. We've got to use our brains and be efficient and use the lever that we have, and that has always been the left and the progressives. That's the state. The state is, in this context with the pandemic, support. After 40 years, nearly 40 years of neoliberalism, we've had a pandemic, which means that we've now got people saying, well, we need to have the state do its part now and not later. And then for this decade, we've seen also feminism, and we've seen that it's impossible to have feminism and progressive, the progressive movement separated. And if we look in Latin America, here too, we've seen that women are the ones that have been those that have raised their voices against the authoritarianism, which is raising its head. They've been more effective than many of we have been. Many men have paled in comparison. So a gender program putting violence against women at the heart of the discussions when it comes to discrimination. Yes, we're very, very committed here. Our president of our group is probably the best voice on behalf of women's rights here in the European Union. It's a parliament. And climate change. Well, then climate change, if we don't do anything here, it's only going to get worse. It's going to make inequality worse. We need to be able to work together and to meet our undertakings and our commitments. The Paris Agreement and the others, we've got to transform our way of going forward. That will improve social justice. Then the fourth agenda, the democratic deficit in our own institutions. We've got to recognize the fact. You've got to make sure that when you mention democracy, you're thinking of the left. You've got to make sure that you've got to have those 4 points. That's what we want to build upon moving forward as social democrats and as progressives here and in Latin America. We think that this is the strategy. We think that this is a shared strategy between the two regions. And this brings to mind three things, because we're not going to put standards for globalization and have limits to neoliberalism unless we agree, unless our two blocks can agree on this. When it comes to combating climate change, well, the world is going to need Latin America. It's the lungs of the planet. It has the best. It is the largest resource of biodiversity. We're going to need Latin America. I mean, you've got hegemony, and then you've got what could go wrong in the coming decades. We've got to try and make sure that there is no train wreck at the end of this. We've got to make sure that both Latin America and Europe come to an agreement and work as one. That's why we're here today. That's what we're discussing. We have a very special guest here today, and I want to say some special things about Brazil in that light. And then I think of Brazil, and I think of Lula and Lula's presidency. What an inspiration to the world Lula's presidency was. A protagonist that brought Brazil to the fore, that brought millions of Brazilians out of poverty. Someone that has inspired each and every one of us. Unfortunately, you can't just think about what's been done in the past. You have to think about the future too. And today, Lula's being here today, it brings to mind what could go wrong. Think about authoritarianism. We know their guidebook. We know how it plays out in Europe. We know it far too well. We've suffered through so much of this in our history. First of all, you start by dividing society. And then you undermine politics and all politicians. Then you undermine the institutions. And then finally, the goal is to end up with just a magic solution of the strong man who will break everything in his way with no respect for the truth. And then you'll end up in just a gray mix of lies. That's what we've seen happen to Brazil today. There's a very famous book. This is the question of our time, indeed, is it not? And it is How Do Democracies Die? I'm sure you're all familiar with that book. Democracies tend to die when someone wants to kill them, because there's always somebody holding the gun. It's usually one, and not. It's usually a man, not a woman. And then there are those who think that they're going to be taking advantage of this, but there's always, politicians and judges and businessmen who think they can take advantage of that individual. And then there's many others who are just looking the other way when it all happens, just your average man on the street that isn't paying attention. And today, what we want to say is that we here, the Social Democrats, the left, we're not turning a blind eye to what is happening in Brazil. We're not missing anything. We're not turning a blind eye when you've got a president who really has no respect for science or human life. We're not missing the fact that there's a president who's insulting women. We're not turning away when we hear speeches which are homophobic and inviting members of parliament to emigrate out of the country. We're not turning our backs on those who are destroying the lungs of the world, and one that is basically ruining the futures of millions of young people by destroying their democracy. And that's what's happening in Brazil. We know that all of this is definitive for the future of Brazil, very essential for what's going to happen in Latin America and for democracies in the West as a whole. All of that is in play, but we know we're in the very best hands, though, and that reassures us. We are in Lula's hands here, so thank you.
Muito obrigado, Javi.
Thank you, Javi. My thanks to all participants, and say that this was an important afternoon's work. Cooperation within the families in Europe and Latin America. This is an opportunity we must not waste. We have talked about these decisive moments which are going to happen in the coming years, and it belongs to us to bring the development so that the continent are for the best. It was a great afternoon's work. I would like to invite our guests for a family photo. Thank you. Our event is now coming to a close.
Parece que lo querían que no lo hagamos allá.
Pode ser aqui embaixo?